Happy birthday to the Property Podcast. Yes, the Property Podcast is 10 years old. But in this episode, we're not going to stop what we've always done. We're going to bring you value. And it's our intention today to inspire you to achieve the biggest things you can over the next 10 years.
Welcome to the Property Podcast, where for 10 years we've been taking time out from what we're supposed to be doing, which now is advising a multi-million pound property fund, which you can find out more about at portfolio.co.uk, and bringing you some of what we learn along the way for free. If you're not subscribed to the Property Podcast after all this time, now would be the perfect moment to put that right. So you can just hit the little plus in Apple Podcasts, or you can hit the follow button on Spotify to make sure you don't miss an episode, because we are not going to be stopping. Now, this is a birthday special, but don't worry, this is not about us being self-indulgent and waffling on about what we've done for 10 years. It's going to be inspiring you to do incredible things over the next 10 years. So we'll get to that in just a second. But first, Rob, a news story that's been a bit overlooked.
It has, and I love this news story that we're bringing you today, because I think the power of the news stories that we've covered on the podcast over the last 10 years is helping you see beyond the headlines and making you aware of how the media can really impact you and everyone else into making wrong decisions. And we couldn't have a better example here because we have two contrasting stories. One is about nationwide house prices being down by 1.1%. So UK property prices fell by 1.1%, and that was reported by Nationwide. Conversely, Halifax reported that UK property prices were up by 1.1%. So, Rob, we're not going to argue on which one is correct. They're both correct according to the data sets that they have. So, therefore, our look at this should be balanced and say, OK, the market isn't quite settled yet. We don't know if it's going up or down, but it's probably somewhere in between and actually flat. That's the balanced view. Did the media, Rob, take the same view?
I know that they didn't, because I knew the date that this data was coming out. I was anticipating seeing it. So before I actually went to the Halifax website to look for the data, just out of interest, I went to the BBC website. And then I went to a couple of others. I thought, oh, maybe they haven't published it because there's nothing about this here at all. And lo and behold, go and look at the data and the number's gone up. So it's like, oh, that's why it hasn't been reported. Because when the nationwide number was going down, you couldn't have missed that one.
No, you couldn't. So the BBC chose not to report property prices going up by 1.1%. But they did choose to report that house prices fell by 1.1%. But of course, when reporting it, they didn't make it sound sensational. Oh no, of course they did. Headline reads, house prices see biggest fall in over 10 years. So where was the headline to say house prices see dramatic rise? There was no balance. This is not a dig at the BBC. This is the media as a whole, because they love a doom and gloom headline. And the reason why is because it attracts clicks or eyeballs, and they will keep doing it because people will click and people will share and people will read it. And that's why, Rob, we will never stop this segment, because I feel like we are the lone voice in trying to add some balance to what is actually happening out there. Is that the majority of our listeners probably have seen the fall headlines, the house prices not doing so well headlines. And that could make people nervous, especially when nobody bothers to report the positive news stories, because house prices go up by 1.1% isn't that exciting, nor is house prices fall by 1.1%. But you can make it exciting with a headline. And if we're going to start off with lessons, Rob, from the last 10 years, the big one for me, and it's not the first time I've said it, and it won't be the last time I've said it, is do not let the media guide your investment decisions.
No, you've already said it, but I want to say it again, just to be really clear. This isn't us trying to go, see, house prices are going up, everything's fine, guys. That's not the point. The point is the selective information that gets pushed to shape a narrative. You do get times when the media are reporting house prices going up like crazy. You get all those headlines like, oh, my house earned more than I did last year, and all that sort of thing. There are times when that happens because that's the narrative that they believe is going to get people's attention. But normally, when you look back over the last 10 years and beyond, the best thing to be doing has tended to be the opposite of the narrative that they're shaping. But this is great because by looking at the papers, you know what everyone else is thinking. So if instead of being swept along by that, you are in a position to come to your own informed view about what's going on, that can create opportunities. So yep, like you said, Rob, that's been a theme over the last decade, and I'm absolutely sure it will be over the next one as well.
In this episode today, we want to inspire you. And the power of time is what's inspirational here, not Rob and I. Because when you look at what you can achieve in the short term as humans, human nature, we often overestimate what can be done in, say, a week, a month, or a year. Over the long term, we often underestimate what is achievable and what can be done. And when you look back over 10 years, you can really prove that, because we're going to focus on what would have happened if you'd started in property 10 years ago, and look at what you could have achieved during those 10 years to hopefully inspire you to achieve great things over the next 10 years. Because day by day, Rob, property doesn't feel that exciting. You know, today you've got your portfolio's worth a certain amount. Tomorrow it'll be worth a different amount, but the amount of adjustment is so minor that you'd never know. And actually, being realistic, it's not even day by day, because you don't assess the valuations of your properties that regularly. So it's really probably half year by half year you could assess the price difference. So property can feel very slow, but what we're going to show you today is it's far from slow. So Rob, let's just look at the facts. Let's go back 10 years ago. Let's look at what was happening. We had Justin Timberlake topping the charts. We had a new pope. We had a new Chinese president. And the most important event of all, the property podcast was created. But let's say you also created your own property portfolio 10 years ago today. How would that be doing?
So when we started back in March 2013, the average UK house price was £168,000. Today, it's £294,000. So that's growth in the average property price of 75%. Inflation over the last decade has averaged 3.9%. So on the whole, property has beaten inflation by roughly 3% a year, which, by the way, is a lot better than I would have put if you'd asked me to just estimate this number before going and looking it up. Because much of the last decade has felt pretty unexciting for property. A lot of it, as we'll come to later, has seemed outright negative. So when you go back hundreds of years, property on average beats inflation by 1% a year. The fact it's beaten it by 3%, and I hadn't even noticed, is actually very surprising.
So that's not too bad. House prices at 168,000 going up to 294,000. Thank you very much. But of course, that is the average. You can outperform that average, and obviously you can underperform that average as well. And the difference between regions is vast. So it is actually very easy to overperform or underperform. For example, if you'd focused your portfolio in the Northeast over the last 10 years, well then I'm sad to say that you would have fell way below that average. And surprisingly, Rob, because it's done so poorly over the last few years, the best region has been London, because all that growth came in the first half of that 10 years. And it hasn't done so well the last 5 years, but the first 5 years was so strong that even today, London is the best performer. So if you started in London 10 years ago today, it's even outperformed the superstars of Manchester and Leeds and other areas that have certainly performed better over the last 5 years, but London performed very, very well in the first 5 years.
Yeah, it's crazy. You can slice data to show anything you want depending on when you start it from. So if you wait a few years and you ran 2016 to 2026, it would show a completely different pattern. I'm almost sure of it. But we're choosing this particular 10 years because that's the 10 years that the podcast has been operating. But yeah, the difference between London and the Northeast, absolutely massive. And that's just regionally. Like if you go down to city level and individual street level, the differences again will be enormous. There'll be people listening and go, I haven't had growth anything like that. And I'm in one of those regions. Well, yeah, that's because it's an average and there can actually be a really big dispersal of outcomes within those averages. So we talk about what's happened on average because it's easy. But one of the great things about property is that you do have the opportunity to do far better than that.
And you can do far better than that, because that's just if you bought one property and it was an average property and you did nothing for the last 10 years. Now, that's not bad, right? You buy one property that was the most average property in the country, and over 10 years, you've seen it grow from 168,000 to 294. Not bad. But if you put a little bit more effort in, then the numbers really start to change. Now, let's not go crazy here. Let's just say that you started investing 10 years ago today, and all you did was reinvest the equity over that 10 years. So, as your property went up in value, you released equity from a remortgage and reinvested it. You don't reinvest your rental profits. You don't add additional savings to it. You just did that. And let's start with £100,000. So let's go back 10 years and say, okay, we've got £100,000. That's all I'm ever going to put into property for the next 10 years. And I'm only going to reinvest the equity that I get. And let's stick to that average. Now, that would be roughly 6% growth year on year, because obviously it compounds all the way up to 75% growth over the 10. So we'll put 100k in, we'll see it grow by 6% each year, and when we have enough equity, we'll reinvest it. Rob, if we did that, what would happen?
Well, what would end up happening is you'd buy your first property, then you'd sit and twiddle your thumbs for 5 years. Then in your 5th year, you would have had enough growth in the value of that property that you could buy another one. So that's cool. You're not putting in any more of your own cash, but you're buying another property. Then you sit around doing nothing again, always listening to the property podcast, of course, because that's really important. But then nothing else happens until year 10, at which point you can then buy another 2 properties with the extra equity that has been built up. So by this point, you own 4 properties. The one that you bought at the first place, the one that you bought with your equity in the 5th year, and the 2 that you bought with your equity in the 10th year. That would give you a portfolio value of £1.3 million, of which your equity is £400,000. So effectively, over 10 years, you've quadrupled your money. You've gone from that initial £100,000 to £400,000 in equity. And it gets better, Rob, before you cut in and go, wow, I can tell you, it gets even better. Because if you assume that that property was making a 4% rental return, you also would have nearly 50k in the bank from rent that you hadn't spent. So not a bad return on just making one investment a decade ago.
It's not bad at all. It's not bad, this property malarkey, is it? We should stick with it. What's really interesting is it gets across another point that we've made a lot over the last 10 years on the podcast, that rent is important and making a profit on your property is paramount. You must make a return. But the difference between the total rent you would have received, 47,000, versus the equity, 400, emphasises something that we've been saying over and over, which is the real wealth in property is made through capital growth. Because in the Northeast, for example, you would have got a better rent than you would have got in London. But you would have made nowhere near as much money because, as we've already said, over the last 10 years, the Northeast has performed the worst, whereas London has performed the best. The yields are miles apart, but the capital growth has more than made up for it, and it's significantly more, multiples more. So, yes, getting a good rent is important, the best you can for the area you operate in, but it's far more important to pick the right area to operate in for long-term wealth. And Rob, we've done 10 years, and those numbers are very impressive, but I think the power of compounding, for me, it's talked about a little bit, but it's really impressive when you actually run the numbers. So let's look forward another 10 years, and let's again assume 6% growth. But let's not reinvest our equity this time. Let's just sit on it. So let's just sit on this portfolio that today is worth 1.3 million with £400,000 equity. And the next 10 years, we're feeling really lazy. We're not going to even reinvest the equity. We're just going to sit on it now. So we only reinvested the equity for the first 10 years. And for the second 10 years, we just sit back, let the portfolio tick over and see the results. And Rob, because of the power of compounding, the results are fantastic.
It's unbelievable. So your portfolio value goes from 1.3 million to 2.3 million, and your equity goes from 400,000 to 1.3 million. So after 20 years, you're at 1.3 million in equity from your original 100,000. And for the second decade, you didn't even do anything.
Now, if you'd reinvested the equity in that decade as well, the numbers would have been bonkers, probably so high that you wouldn't have believed it. So we just played out a really conservative scenario here for you to show you that the longer term view you take on property, the better you will be rewarded. It doesn't matter if property prices go up by 1% or down 1% month on month, which over a month is a big swing either way. But over the long term, the price movement does matter and makes a huge difference to your wealth, a massive difference.
I think it's worth jumping in with a couple of caveats because some people will be listening and go, yeah, but what about this? So I think it's worth saying that all the future values are stated in today's money. So of course, you need to factor inflation in. But even if you take the 6% down to 3%, which is the number that it's beaten inflation by, and so you're looking at it in real terms, it's still pretty seriously impressive. And you could say, oh, well, the last decade has been unusually good for property and you're projecting it forward. Actually, I don't think it has been unusually good, but say that you think the next decade is going to be worse than that. Well, again, we are just taking an average scenario. You can do better than that by picking the right areas, by picking the property types that are going to do best. You can do better than that by getting a discount, which effectively is free equity that you can tap into in the future. You can even, if you insist, actually do some work on your properties and increase their value. There's loads of things you can do. So yes, you can always pick holes in things like this. So the point of this isn't to model out, this is exactly what will happen. And you can always disagree about the assumptions that are going in, but there are a lot of opportunities in there that haven't been factored in. Oh, and the rent. I haven't even talked about the rent that you're collecting. So even if you damp all the numbers down to be as conservative as you possibly want to be, your 10-year and especially your 20-year numbers are still looking pretty spectacular. You might not know it, but in the background to this podcast, we run a business called Property Hub Invest that helps investors build portfolios. We use relationships that we have with some of the UK's best developers to secure properties at a discount and make the whole process super hands-off. So if you want to invest in high-quality properties for the long term and not take up any of your time doing it, then you can check out Property Hub Invest at propertyhub.net/invest.
So if you're new to property investment, haven't started, but have only just started and it's all feeling a bit overwhelming and how am I going to make it happen? Well, time will make it happen. But if you're new, or even if you're not new to property investment, you may be thinking, well, is now a good time? Because, so-and-so's happening and that's happening. Again, that's where looking back over the last 10 years can really make a difference. So those numbers we've run through, pretty impressive, right? But that's all on the back of some major changes to both the industry and the world. So we had significant tax changes where you could no longer offset the mortgage interest against your rental profits. When that happened, everyone went, property investment's dead. Buy to let, it's gone, it's dead, forget it. It survived, it carried on. We had Brexit. Don't really care what your view is on Brexit, but let's just say Brexit caused a lot of turmoil. I don't think many people would argue over that. The country was divided, again, statistically proven, and there was lots of uncertainty off the back of it. Again, people said property investment's not going to work during this climate. It did. We had more political drama because Jeremy Corbyn nearly came in, and again, trying to stay away from politics as best they can. Let's just say that Jeremy Corbyn terrified property investors. And then, Rob, we had the small issue of a global pandemic, which is probably one of the biggest events over the last 100 years. Off the back of that, of course, you would expect property to collapse. Again, it didn't.
No, and those are just the ones that we've listed off the top of our head. Those are the big ones. But there'll be 20 other things that we can't even remember now because it felt like a big deal at the time, but turned out not to be.
And I think it's important to emphasise that, just listening at oh yeah, that was the past. But when you were living through each of those things as a property investor, it was terrifying. It was really scary as a property investor to navigate all those events. But hindsight allows us to see, actually, it doesn't really matter. So again, in the short term, media noise, events around the world can seem very overwhelming, and it always can feel, it's worse now. But actually, throughout history, there's always something going on. There's always something upsetting happening. There's always something that can distract you or give you a reason not to push on with your hopes and your dreams and your financial ambitions. But that's why we recap the last 10 years, not to just acknowledge it happened, but to actually say, listen, things happen and things are going to happen over the next 10 years. And you can use them as excuses to stop you hitting your goals. And you'll feel okay about it because you have a story to tell yourself, I can't invest because of external factor. But you are in control. You're the one who can make it happen. And for those who navigated all those events and who have been investing for over the last 10 years, or the majority of it, well done to you, because you've been rewarded. When others use those events as excuses not to push on, you did.
You could have made a very convincing case at any point, at any year over the last 10 years, that rather than starting now, let's just wait and see how this thing plays out. By the time that thing has played out, the next thing will have come along. So there'll be another reason not to do it. But let's come in with another caveat. Well, okay, there hasn't been a property price crash over the last decade, and at some point there will be. Yes, that is completely true. But if you wait for the crash to happen before you start investing, that just doesn't really work. Because for a start, it means you can only start investing once every, say, 18 years. Also, it's going to be a nightmare to actually get any lending on your property at that point because that's when no one wants to lend. And also, you probably won't have the guts to invest at that point because it's very easy to say, oh, well, once everything's crashed, that's the perfect time to buy, so I'll just do that. Not a lot of people actually do that. To tie back into what you were saying, Rob, but when you're living it, it's very different. It's very easy to talk the big talk about being greedy when others are fearful. When everything's fine, the reality is very different. But also, if you do wait for that to happen, then you've missed however many years of growth. So if you thought the tax changes in 2015 or Brexit in 2016 or the political stuff in 2017 was going to bring about a crash, well, it could have done, but it didn't. And therefore, you've missed out on so many years of growth since then. You've really not helped yourself. So I think, Rob, while it's completely true to say there hasn't been a crash in the last 10 years, statistically, there probably will be in the next 10 years. But the beautiful thing about zooming out is that it doesn't matter that much. Over a 10 or a 20-year view, none of this stuff matters that much. Because you're not valuing your property every month and being graded on how well you're doing, none of that matters. What matters is where you end up in the future. And we've just been through ample examples of where property can get you.
And don't let a potential crash at some point in a future date unknown put you off. Because, yes, I also think there'll be a crash in the next 10 years. But I also think property prices will grow more in the next 10 years than they have in the last 10 years. One of the reasons, not the only reason, but one of the reasons that we've not had a crash over the last 10 years is that property prices haven't gone up high enough to come back crashing down. They've grown 75%, which is great, and we showed you what you could do with growth at that level. But if you actually look back historically, that's pretty modest compared to what property's done in other decades gone by. So in the next 10 years, I think if we do have a crash, it's because property prices have accelerated so much. And in 10 years' time, including a crash, I imagine property prices will have outperformed the 75% we've seen from the last 10 years. Time will tell. But I think the overriding lesson here, if we summarise it, is that action and consistent action plus time equals incredible results. If you just take consistent action, and it doesn't have to be incredible action, just consistent action. So in this case, pushing forward with your property portfolio, and then you give it time, you can do amazing things. But you can apply this in any area of your life. Look at Rob with his books. He published his first property book in 2013, 10 years ago. In the first week, probably sold maybe a few hundred copies at best. But he continued to improve his craft, put better books out there, grew his profile more over those 10 years. And now he's sold over 140,000 books, which is absolutely outrageous. Still can't get over that number. And has signed a deal with Penguin. 10 years ago, was typing up a book that he didn't know how it was going to do or perform. And did he have all that success in week one, month one, or year one? No. But consistently taking action and allowing time to do its thing has resulted in incredible results because they compound. And also remember, big episode coming up soon with Rob's new book being released by Penguin. We'll talk about that again soon. But it's not just books, Rob. It's not just property. It's business as a whole. It's whatever you do in life, fitness, whatever you want. If you take consistent action and mix in the long term, you do great things.
Totally, but it doesn't feel like it. I think that's an important point, especially with property, because nothing's happening most of the time. And I think if property feels exciting, you're probably doing something wrong. It kind of shouldn't be exciting. But the same goes for anything. When you look at what we've done in business, like taking this podcast from nothing to one of the biggest business shows in the UK and launching a fund off the back of it and growing the businesses off the back of it.
10 years ago, I was in my spare bedroom. That was the business. Today, we have offices in London and Manchester. We've sold businesses, some for a little, some for a reasonable amount. We've launched magazines. We've launched the forum. 10 years ago, it was a bloke in a bedroom. And today, with time and consistent action, it's a bigger thing. And hopefully, Rob, it's even bigger again in 10 years because we'll keep taking the action and we'll keep giving it time.
Yeah, I think the point is, though, most days over that 10 years, has it felt like, whoa, this rocket ship that I'm riding? No, like most of the time, it doesn't feel like anything's happening at all. It feels frustratingly slow. You want things to be going faster. It feels like you're not getting anywhere at all. It's only when you let time work its magic that you can look back and go, wow, we've done a lot here. We should probably also say we've effed up quite a lot over the last decade as well. And when that's happened, it's so easy for that to seem like, oh no, this is a disaster. How are we ever going to deal with it? But again, time. It goes over time from being an absolute disaster, what you're going to do, to being a funny story, to forgetting it even happened in the first place. And I think you're particularly good at this. But as a general point, the faster you can get through that process with bad things, the better.
Yeah, exactly. Good will happen to you over time. Bad will happen to you over time. Taking it back to property, again, you know, it's not all rainbows and unicorns. It's not a straight line up. You know, you have all those challenges in the background. You have tenants that don't pay you. You have refurbishment costs that you weren't expected. It's not all easy. It never is. But also, most life events aren't that important, whether in property or outside of property. They can feel important, they can feel big, but really, the health of you, your friends and your family, their happiness, that's what's important. I don't want to sound like a bit of a hippie here, but it is, it's true. So changes to the tax treatment of property investors, yeah, it might feel pretty bad at the time, but actually, in the grand scheme of things, it doesn't matter. something that we've talked about on the podcast before, but it's a great question to ask yourself. If you're winding yourself up on a particular situation in property or outside of property, just ask yourself the question, will I care about this in 5 years' time? And if you will, then okay, carry on worrying about it and dealing with it. But I reckon about 99% of the things you spend your time worrying and stressing about aren't worth it and won't be a factor in 5 years' time. And that's a great way of kind of framing most things that go on. Most things aren't important. We as humans sensationalize things that are going on, and we tell ourselves stories in our heads of like, oh no, now this is the disaster, or this is going to be the biggest thing ever. And the truth is that whether you're an optimist and you think it's the biggest thing ever, it probably won't be. And if you're a bit of a pessimist and you think this is the worst thing ever, it probably won't be. Life are just moments that happen, and many moments you forget. And sometimes you have big events that happen in your life that do need your time and attention. But as I've said, 99% of the time, it's not that.
So hopefully all of that has made you feel great about what you can achieve. And that's the point. If you're finding things slow and difficult at the moment, that's normal. Doesn't mean you're doing anything wrong. You will be able to look back in the future and be really grateful for what's happened. And if you have been doing this for a while, take a moment to look back, because again, when you're in it day to day, it doesn't seem like much has happened. But if you do take a moment to look back, I think you'll probably be very surprised by everything that you've achieved. But something else that's been consistent over the last 10 years has been giving you a resource, something extra at the end of the show. And this week, we've got a couple of books. We've talked about them before. They are classics, and they'll be super helpful if you need a bit more inspiration to make that first investment or start that business or whatever it is for you. The first one is called The One Thing by Gary Keller. It's one of those books that I reread every so often, and it's basically about tuning out distraction, focusing on what matters, doing that thing consistently, and then, like we've talked about, allowing that to slowly compound and do great things for you over time. And Rob, there's another book that you talked about way back at the start, probably within the first 10 episodes, that has a similarly inspiring message.
I'm glad I read this book so early on in our journey, and I'm glad that we did apply some of the lessons this book taught us. And this book is called The Magic of Thinking Big, and it's by David Schwartz. And the idea is a simple one, but I still really encourage you to go and read or listen to this if you haven't already. Because the point is, if you're going to set goals, you may as well set massive goals. And think big. Because as we said, over the long term, thinking big and taking action and treating it over the long term, you could do incredible things. If you're going to think about your goals and your ambitions, and you're going to spend time thinking about them, well, then you may as well make them as big as possible. I think Donald Trump actually said something similar. So he's probably read this book as well. But it's an absolute classic. And I highly recommend it to all our listeners, but particularly those who are starting out, those who are starting to dream of what is possible in their lives, whether it be through property or anything else. Because this book had a huge impact on me 10 years ago. And I'm sure every one of you listening who goes on to pick it up and read it, it'll impact you in a positive way as well. So that's it. 10 years of the Property Podcast. We'll wrap it up there. No, of course we will not wrap it up there. We're going to be back week in, week out for the foreseeable, because we love this. And we want to thank you. We want to thank you for your support over the last 10 years. Many of you have been with us for the majority of those 10 years. I've met many of you. I know Rob's met many of you. It's just been absolutely incredible. We have recorded this in our spare bedrooms over the last 10 years through ups, downs, through highs, lows, children being born, huge life events. And we've done it week in, week out. We've never missed a week. And a big part of that, a huge part of that, is the incredible encouragement and support that we've got from you, our listeners, over the last 10 years. We would do this anyway because we just love this part of our week and doing the podcast. But I tell you what, it's a cherry on top, plus loads of sprinkles, the fact that you love it too and you supported us so much. We're in the top 10 of the business charts, and we have been for quite a number of years now. And we compete against some of the biggest podcasts out there. The fact it's just us two in our respective spare bedrooms talking each week about a subject we love and that you love it too makes it all the worthwhile. So, Rob, to end, I think we can only end a 10-year episode on this. Why don't we whack on Stevie Wonder singing Happy Birthday to the Property Podcast and read out some of the lovely reviews that we've had in over the last few weeks leading up to this pod.
Let's do it. Cue the music. Okay, let's start with Renna Pat Pat, who says, so informative. I love this podcast. The Robs are down to earth and keep you up to date with all things property investment. A great resource. Thanks for all your hard work.
This review's in from Rob. I assume this is a Rob. Straightforward information. Rob and Rob provide the information that's not clickbait, reading the statistics on housing and providing their insights. 5 stars.
Rich says, the Property Podcast has been a game changer. These two guys have enlightened me and made me smile along the way for several years now. This is the only podcast I listen to regularly. They're so energetic and the amount of effort they put in is awe-inspiring. Keep it up. We will.
Lainey James, thank you for your review. All the stars in the sky. We have been listening to your podcast for the last 5 years, and in that time, we've made 4 buy-to-let investments and learned a lot about the economy and the market. We still have lots to learn, but the 2 weekly check-ins with Rob and Rob consistently reassure us that we're on the right path, even when the world around us tries to convince us otherwise. Thank you for all the in-depth content you've put out there, and congratulations on your 10 years of continued success. Here's to many more. Thank you, and congratulations on your portfolio.
J-Dawes says, I love the podcast and listen to it in the gym, at work and on my commute. Thank you for all the content you put out. It's easy to follow and well explained. I'm looking to invest this year and this podcast has certainly helped. P.S. Sorry I haven't left a review before. We'll let you off.
And we'll wrap up with WHU Neil. Guessing it's a Hammers fan. Top quality podcast, 100% recommended. Well, thank you everyone. We recommend that you join us on Tuesday for Ask Rob and Rob. And, of course, we'll be back with the podcast next Thursday. And by the way, if you've listened this far and you're still here in this part and you've not left a review or told other people about the podcast, come on, do us a birthday present. Leave a review and tell some people about the pod. And let's push it up even higher in the charts over the next 10 years. Thanks, everyone. Take care. Have fun. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.